Elias Finch, a new orderly at the Blackwood Asylum for the mentally afflicted, found his daily rounds in the East Wing systemically disquieting. The vast, somber edifice, built of dark, pitted stone, always seemed to exhale a chill that went deeper than autumn air. The corridors, lit by sparse gaslight, smelled perpetually of carbolic soap, stale linen, and an undercurrent of something acrid and earthy. What disturbed Elias most was the profound systemic quietude emanating from certain locked wards, a quiet that spoke not of peace, but of operational void. His inventory checks revealed a disturbing pattern. The asylum consumed far more sedative solution and restraint straps than its official inpatient count. According to Medical Journal, Volume 14, 1903, anomalous narcotic consumption. Data want from the administration, hinting at a hidden population, a shadow ward secreted away from official ledgers. A low rhythmic hum, almost imperceptible to the untrained ear. Industrial Safety Bulletin number 47B, unscheduled vibrational events, seemed out to vibrate through the very foundations of the building, an anomalous energetic signature. Elias instinctively knew was not from the antiquated steam heating system. Elias's operational disquiet truly grew as he frequented the storage rooms, where shelves bulged with dusty bottles of chloral hydrate and rolls of coarse, wear-marked leather restraints, says Pittsburgh Press. 1897, factory accident involving unsecured restraints reported by local news. His ledger, bound in cracked leather, bore the fresh scrawl of his nightly entries, tallying supplies that dwindled far faster than they should. By flickering gaslight, Elias noted quantities, his ears pricked up, straining to interpret the anomalous resonant frequency that resonated through his workspace. As a pervasive substrata energetic transmission, one frost-tipped morning, as Elias retrieved a new batch of documents from the superintendent's office, a Gothic chamber of towering bookshelves and dimly lit by the green glow of a banker's lamp, he uncovered an old, bound register tucked away beneath more recent files. The ledger was thick, its marbled cover faded and corners blunted by time. Flipping through, Elias's fingers traced entries that ceased abruptly decades before. The ink faded to a rusty hue, the handwriting a stark, disciplined script, much unlike the hurried scrawl of modern records. In this forgotten tome, Elias found references to a lower sanatorium, a term that absent from any current floor plan or directory. Journal of Asylum Admin. 1909, unlisted institutional annex report within. The institution. These entries spoke of patient transfers to the lower sanatorium, yet alarmingly, there were no corresponding records of discharge or transfer out. Patients who entered never exited, simply vanished from record and memory. This discovery elicited a profound physiological distress response within Elias. Compelled by a mix of dread and obligation, Elias decided to delve deeper during the shadowy quietude of night shifts, when less observant eyes of senior staff turned towards slumber. He searched through corridors convoluted, like the schematics of an archaic pipe network, each turn revealing layers of peeling paint and echoing Industrial Safety Memo 32A, structural integrity and lead paint hazards, a past dulled by time and neglect. As Elias explored, the persistent resonant frequency grew more pronounced. He found a rusted door in the deepest bowels of East Wing, its metal cool and flaked beneath his touch. Behind it stretched a narrow descending stairway, choked with the metallic smell of damp iron and pervasive atmospheric degradation, such as Pittsburgh Press 1903, industrial corrosion in underground structures, described in factory incident reports. Each step he took reverberated with the echo of that anomalous resonant frequency, pulling him deeper into the unexplored depths of the asylum. The staircase ended abruptly at another door, this one heavy, wooden and banded with steel. A robust barrier that seemed as much to contain something within as to keep others out. The air here was stifling, thick with the tang of corrosion and an unregistered presence that brushed against the edge of Elias's senses, a whisper of movement, a thermal anomaly flitting just beyond the grasp of sight. With a breath that plumed visibly in the cold air, Elias pushed the door open. Beyond lay the lower sanatorium, a long-forgotten ward hidden from the world above. The room was vast, lined with rows of iron-barred cells, each a small cage that might once have restrained. Medical case study, 1911, Protocols for Extreme Behavioral Control, the CA. Most troubled of souls. Now they stood empty, the bars encrusted with the iron residue of years, the floor scattered with fragments of leather from disintegrated restraints. Yet the air was not still. The resonant frequency vibrated through the room, emanating from the far end where machinery loomed, old, enigmatic devices, their purpose obscured by age and rust, connected by a network of pipes and chains that crawled along the walls like the intricate components of a dormant industrial apparatus. At the center of this machinery sat an enigmatic contraption, a chair of sorts, encircled by mechanical arms and hat straps, worn yet unmistakably waiting. This resembles Pittsburgh Press 1907. Workshop incident, malfunction of industrial press. Previous. Reported incidents. As Elias approached, a sudden physiological tremor registered. The machine stirred faintly, as though breathing, and the humming intensified, a sound now clearly not born of any known machinery, but resonating with a self-sustaining energetic signature. Experiencing acute systemic dread yet operationally compelled, Elias reached to touch the cold metal of the device. As his hand made contact, the air shifted. The thermal anomaly at his vision's edge solidified. Hand atmospheric oscillations resolved into a disturbing data stream. The humming was indeed no part of any mechanical system, but a sustained resonant output, registering undocumented human termination to the devouring silence of the lower sanatorium. Servos inside the machine whined softly, as if waking from a long slumber, and the air thrummed with the power of undocumented operational parameters, leaving Elias with a burning question: what happened here? And why does this place still live, when all within it has long since been forgotten? The factory stood as a colossal monument to industry, its chimneys belching black smoke that stained the sky. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of hot metal and oil, a constant presence that clung to the lungs. Workers moved like clockwork figures, their movements dictated by the relentless rhythm of the machines. The foreman, Mr. Hemlock, was a man of rigid routine, his eyes missing nothing. He had noted the recent irregularities in the East Wing, a series of unexplained pressure releases and equipment failures that defied logical explanation. The official report, filed under Pittsburgh Press October 22, 1901, plant malfunction investigated, cited faulty valves, but the men knew better. They spoke in hushed tones of a thermal anomaly, a presence that seemed to warp the very air around the massive steam press. Young Thomas, new to the arduous line, felt the oppressive weight of the vast, clanging place immediately. The cacophony of pistons and drive belts was a physical force, a deafening, groaning roar that promised mechanical order, but delivered only raw industrial chaos. On his third day, he witnessed his first tragic incident. A seasoned worker named Miller, his attention seemingly stolen by a flicker of shadow near the overhead crane, misjudged a step. His hand was caught in the rolling mechanism, a swift, brutal action. There was no such emission, only a sickening crunch and a sudden, violent pressure release of steam from a nearby pipe. Journal of Industrial Medicine, Volume 29, 1907. Traumatic amputations cause severe psychological shock. These dire occurrences frequently highlighted the precariousness of working conditions and the unquantifiable human price. Miller was rushed away, his face a mask of vacant horror, leaving behind a dark smear of iron residue on the polished floor. The foreman merely marked it in his log, his expression unreadable. The East Wing became Thomas's personal purgatory. It was colder there, a deep, unnatural chill that seeped through layers of wool and denim. The lights, gas mantles encased in wire mesh, would flicker and dim without cause. Shadows danced at the edge of vision, not like men, but like shifting, distorted shapes of resting machinery. He began to see things. A still figure standing motionless by the far wall, its form indistinct in the haze. When he looked again, it was gone. The other men avoided his eyes when he mentioned it. They had their own stories, whispers of tools moving on their own, of whispered metallic warnings that sounded like the hiss of a boiler. Industrial Safety Memorandum. 12 to C. Unexplained atmospheric fluctuations require increased ventilation. This directive was often overlooked amidst the constant demands of production. The persistent, pervasive sensation of disturbance defied simple solutions, yet the drafts here felt quite systemically aberrant. The heart of the trouble was the old forging hammer, a monstrous piece of equipment slated for demolition, a looming presence. It was never used, yet sometimes in the dead hours of the night shift, Thomas would hear its great piston sigh, a deep, unsettling sound, as if testing its own immense strength. It was around this hulking machine that the air felt most wrong, thick and heavy, humming with a subaudible frequency that made his very teeth ache. He found a discarded, grease-stained leaflet tucked behind a support beam. Pittsburgh Press, Nov. 5, 1898. Foundry accident. Hammer failure claims 3 lives. The official report meticulously detailed metal fatigue, yet the deeper mechanical reality felt far more insidious and purposeful. The men said the hammer had a will of its own. Driven by an urgent recognition of systemic instability, Thomas sought answers, a desperate quest for understanding. He spent his meager breaks in the plant's tiny, dust-choked archive, a desolate room filled with brittle ledgers and technical manuals, seeking institutional acknowledgement of the systemic aberration that festered in the East Wing. He found a reference in a brittle-paged medical journal. New England Journal, Volume 11, 1892, noted infrasound sensitivity in factory workers, causing hysteria. The clinical detachment of such analyses failed to capture the profound visceral horror he experienced. This dry medical observation seemed only to rationalize an inexplicable terror, offering a clinical, cold comfort. The anomalies grew more aggressive. One evening, as Thomas was finishing his shift, the main power drive for the entire wing seized. The silence that fell was more terrifying than the noise. In the sudden quiet, a new sound emerged, a rhythmic metallic clicking like a telegraph key coming from the silent forging hammer. Then the lights died completely. In the profound blackness he felt a presence, an intense cold that wrapped around him. A figure materialized from the gloom, not a man but a thing of shimmering heat and distorted metal, a pure thermal anomaly. It didn't move toward him. It simply was, a standing wave of wrongness in the physical world. A low moan like stressed steel filled the air. Thomas stood frozen, his mind overpressuring, but his body capable of only a shallow, panicked breath. This was not a systemic disruption. It was a mechanical compromise of reality itself. He stumbled back, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had to tell someone, had to make them understand. He went straight to Hemlock's office. The foreman listened, his face a granite slab, impassive and unyielding, as Thomas spilled his harrowing story. The intense cold, the phantom figure, the unsettling sounds, the industrial anomaly itself. When Thomas was finally finished, Hemlock didn't laugh. He didn't scoff. He simply leaned forward, his eyes boring into Thomas's, and in a low, measured voice said, "That hammer is operationally integrated. It's an integral part of the plant's ecosystem. We do not speak of it. We work around it." Pittsburgh Press, Jan 17, 1903. Inquiry. Worker delirium. Talk deemed consequential. Such open discussion was forbidden knowledge within these walls. You will forget what you saw, for your own good. The threat was veiled in bureaucratic language, but it was unmistakable. The system protected itself. Defeated and profoundly terrified, Thomas returned to his post. The wing was back online, everything running with a brutal, relentless, normal efficiency. But the cold, gnawing fear was now an indelible part of him, a heavy stone in his gut. He watched the other men, their faces blank, their movements precise, almost mechanical. Were they all simply ignoring it? Or were they like Miller, just one misstep away from being utterly consumed by the ever-grinding machinery? Their bodies and minds becoming just another component part of the factory's relentless, indifferent process. He looked at the great silent forging hammer. It was just a machine, a collection of iron and steel. But in the flickering gaslight, its massive form seemed to watch him, a patient, systemically aberrant intelligence waiting within the cogs and pistons. He knew then that he was trapped. The factory didn't just build products. It consumed men, and its hunger was insatiable. JAMA, Volume 58, 1912. Institutional fatalism describes industrial workers' surrender to the relentless machinery. Industrial Safety Bulletin 4. Hazard identification is critical protocol. The shift bell rang. a harsh metallic clang that signaled not an end but merely a pause. The sound was swallowed by the endless groaning roar of the factory, a beast that was never truly asleep. The foundry's whistle pressure released through the pre-dawn fog, an anomaly signaling the start of another shift. Workers emerged from tenements, their faces grey with exhaustion and iron residue. A grim sight noted by the Pittsburgh press. Foug 2, 1895. Foundry workforce faces daily peril. They moved as one, a single operational unit integrated into the great machine. The factory gates groaned open, a sound like a pressure release from some deep systemic failure within the city's heart. Inside, the air was thick with coal dust and the smell of hot metal. The great steam hammers pounded with a rhythm that shook the very foundations, each blow a reminder of us Industrial Safety Bulletin 12C 1890, Pressure Vessel Integrity Protocols. Men worked the Bessemer converters, their faces illuminated by the hellish glow of molten steel, their movements precise, almost mechanically compromised by years of repetition. There were stories, of course, whispered during lunch breaks, tales of still figures seen near the number 3 furnace, thermal anomalies that flickered at the edge of vision. Most dismissed it as fatigue, a trick of the heat and the ceaseless noise. A documented phenomenon detailed in B. Journal of Industrial Medicine, Volume 14, 1903. Auditory hallucinations and cognitive dissonance in prolonged high-decibel work environments. Arthur Higgins, a foreman of 20 years, paid the stories no mind. He was a practical man, concerned with quotas and output, the smooth operation of his section. But lately even he had noticed things. A tool would be misplaced. A pressure gauge would read incorrectly, then right itself. Small systemic aberrations that disrupted the perfect order he maintained. He felt a growing dread, not of some spectral presence, but of a deeper, more insidious failure within the system itself. It was a feeling of being a small replaceable cog in a vast, unknowable machine that was beginning to show signs of critical wear. The incident began at the rolling mill. A new man, Jenkins, was feeding sheet metal into the rollers. There was a loud shriek of protesting metal, a sound that cut through the factory's din. It wasn't a human sound, but a mechanical pressure release of catastrophic proportions. The main drive belt snapped, whipping back with lethal force. Jenkins was thrown clear, his arm bent at an unnatural angle. The machinery ground to a halt, and in the sudden ringing silence Arthur saw it. For a fraction of a second, a shimmering thermal anomaly stood where Jenkins had been, its form indistinct before it vanished. The Pittsburgh Press, March 15, 1897, reported, "Factory incident claims 1. Drive belt failure cited," later detailing. Work resumed, but the atmosphere had changed. The accident report was filed, the machinery repaired, but a pervasive sense of operational instability remained. Arthur began to study the old schematics, the safety bulletins yellowed with age. He found references to the site's history, to a previous structure that had burned, its foundations now buried beneath the current factory floor. As Industrial Safety Memorandum, 47B, 1888. Cryptically noted, persistent thermal fluctuations, west quadrant, origin unknown, deemed non-critical. The anomalies became more frequent. Workers reported tools moving on their own, cold spots in the sweltering heat of the foundry, and a constant low hum that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It was as if the factory was not just a place of work, but a living, breathing entity with its own aberrant physiology. Arthur started keeping a log, not of production numbers, but of these strange occurrences. He noted the times, the locations, the men involved. He was no longer managing men. He was documenting the symptoms of a sick building. His notes began to resemble a medical case study, referencing Doty, The Lancet, 1899, on hysterical contagion and mass psychogenic illness in confined workplaces. One evening, working late on the monthly production report, Arthur heard it. A soft rhythmic scraping from the basement level, the domain of the massive coal-fed boilers. It was a sound that shouldn't exist, a sound not accounted for in any of the mechanical manuals. Against his better judgment, he took a lantern and descended the iron staircase. The air grew thick and heavy, smelling of damp coal and ozone. The scraping grew louder, more deliberate. He turned a corner, and his lantern light fell upon a still figure, its back to him, hunched over a pile of coal. It was dressed in the heavy leather apron and cap of a long bygone era, its movements slow, methodical, as if performing a task from a forgotten shift. Arthur froze, his breath catching in his throat. This was no trick of the light. This was a tangible operational relic. The figure stopped scraping and slowly began to turn. Arthur did not wait to see its face. He fled back up the stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic biological pressure release. He locked the basement door and leaned against it, his mind racing. This was beyond his understanding. It was an industrial anomaly of the highest order, a breach in the very fabric of reality within his factory. He couldn't report it. Who would believe him? They would say he was suffering from nerves, a case of industrial fatigue as described in the British Medical Journal 1911. Volume 2, Neurasthenia in Supervisory Industrial Personnel. The next day the factory was different. The noises were louder, the cold spots more pronounced. The machinery seemed to have a will of its own, starting and stopping at odd intervals. The workers were on edge, their movements jerky, their eyes wide with a fear they couldn't articulate. They were no longer men. They were components in a systemically aberrant mechanism. Arthur tried to maintain order, but his authority was crumbling. The very laws of physics that governed his world seemed to be unraveling. A memo from corporate, demanding an explanation for the drop in productivity, felt like a missive from another sane universe. That night he knew he had to return to the basement. He had to understand. He armed himself with a heavy wrench, a pathetic weapon against what he feared he would find. The basement door was unlocked, swinging open at his touch. The darkness within was absolute, a physical presence that swallowed the beam of his lantern. The scraping was there, but now it was joined by other sounds. A low, wet coughing, the clank of chains, a faint, desperate whispering that seemed to come from the very bricks. He moved forward, the beam of his light dancing over the monstrous forms of the boilers. He found the source of the scraping. It was the same figure, but now it was not alone. Other shapes moved in the gloom, spectral workers forever trapped on their shift. They paid him no mind, continuing their endless, futile tasks. One, a man with a terrible wound in his chest that seeped a black, oily iron residue, looked directly at Arthur. Its eyes were not eyes, but pools of shadow. It raised a translucent hand and pointed towards the farthest boiler. Compelled by a dread deeper than fear, Arthur approached. The boiler was old, its rivets rusted, a model phased out decades ago. Etched into its iron surface, almost worn away by time, were words. Pittsburgh Press, October 31st, 1882. Foundry Inferno. All hands lost. Boiler systemic failure blamed for catastrophic explosion. This was the source. This was the anchor. The factory had been built on the grave of its predecessor, and the tragedy had seeped into the stone and metal, creating a permanent, mechanically compromised zone where the past was forever integrated with the present. The whispering grew louder, coalescing into a single systemically aberrant thought that filled his mind. It was not a voice of malice, but of immense eternal sorrow and the crushing weight of endless labor. It was the soul of the old factory, and it was lonely. It wanted workers. It wanted a foreman. It wanted him. Arthur felt a coldness seep into his bones, not the cold of the grave, but the cold of dead machinery. He felt his own will, his own memories, beginning to dissolve, being replaced by the relentless rhythm of the ghost shift. He looked down at his hands and saw them becoming translucent, the wrench falling through his fading fingers with a clatter that was swallowed by the oppressive silence. He tried to pressure release, but it emerged as a silent, internal pressure release. The last thing he saw was the still figure of the old foreman nodding to him, a gesture of welcome, before the darkness took him completely. The next morning, the day shift arrived to find the factory running perfectly. The whistles blew on time, the hammers fell in perfect rhythm, and the production quotas were met with unprecedented efficiency. The workers felt a strange sense of peace, of order. If anyone noticed that Foreman Arthur Higgins was missing, no one remarked upon it. And if a new, particularly diligent worker, with a faint, shimmering thermal anomaly about him seemed familiar, it was dismissed as a trick of the steam and the new, efficient lighting. The machine was whole again. It had integrated its new foreman. The system was stable. The industrial safety memorandum was filed away. Another anomaly resolved. The great engine of industry hummed, its hunger temporarily sated. The foundry's whistle pressure released through the pre-dawn gloom, a mechanical shriek that tore men from their beds. Elias pulled on his heavy work clothes, the wool stiff with the iron residue of yesterday's labor. He joined the river of shadowed figures flowing toward the mill gates, their breath pluming in the chill air. Pittsburgh Telegraph, APR 19, 1902. Local man vanishes from steel mill. Police investigation. Inside, the heat hit him like a physical blow. The great steam hammers pounded with a rhythm that shook the very foundations, each impact vibrating through the soles of his boots. Men moved like automatons, their faces grimed beyond recognition. Elias took his place at the furnace, feeding the ravenous maw with coal until his muscles pressure released in protest. The foreman, a man named Henderson, patrolled the floor with a watchful eye, his presence a constant reminder of the relentless pace demanded by the owners. A new worker, a young man named Finn, struggled with a heavy casting mold. Henderson barked an order, his voice barely audible over the din. "Keep it moving. The line doesn't stop for your incompetence." The boy flinched, his hands shaking as he tried to right the heavy frame. Elias saw the fear in his eyes, a raw, primal terror that had no place in this temple of progress. It was a look he'd seen before, in the faces of men before a terrible accident. The memory was a cold stone in his gut. The days blurred into a cycle of exhaustion and dread. The mill was a living entity, a beast of brick and steel that fed on sweat and iron residue. Strange things began to happen. Tools would go missing from their designated racks, only to reappear in another part of the complex. Whispers would echo from empty corridors, sounding like the hiss of escaping steam. Elias dismissed it as superstition, the product of tired minds. Journal of Clinical Pathology, 1895. Chronic industrial exposure causes physiological degradation, sensory distortion, fatigue. It was a pressure that built behind the eyes, a feeling of being watched by the machinery. Dr. E. Thorne's notes, 1901, abnormal ocular reactions. Persistent tremor indicate advanced neurasthenia symptom. Some of the older men claimed the place was mechanically compromised, that the original construction had been flawed, built on a site of some older tragedy. They spoke of a thermal anomaly, a patch of intense cold that would sometimes form near the primary forge, a place where a man had supposedly fallen into a vat of molten metal years ago. Yet he couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease that clung to the iron-girded walls. Industrial Hygiene Reports, 1910. Persistent auditory phenomena, frequently linked to atmospheric pressure fluctuations. One Tuesday, the main power hammer jammed. The sudden silence was more deafening than the noise. In the unnatural quiet, a low moan seemed to emanate from the machine itself, a sound of grinding metal and profound strain. Henderson ordered a crew, including Elias and the young Finn, to investigate the internal mechanism. As they opened the inspection plate, a wave of frigid air washed over them. Inside, deep within the greasy iron darkness, something shifted. It wasn't a rat. It was a shape, a coalescence of shadow and oil-slick metal that seemed to absorb the dim light. Finn, standing closest, let out a sharp, truncated pressure release. He stumbled back, pointing a trembling finger. There's something in there," he stammered. Henderson scoffed, peering into the gloom. Industrial Hygiene Reports, 1910. Persistent auditory phenomena, frequently linked to atmospheric pressure fluctuations. Now get a scraper and clear it out. But Elias saw it too. For a fleeting second, he saw a face reflected in the polished piston rod. A face that was not human, its features stretched and distorted as if by immense force. It was an industrial anomaly, a thing that should not exist within the ordered logic of the machine. The incident was logged, but no official explanation was ever given. The work resumed, but the atmosphere had changed. The men worked with a new, brittle tension, their eyes constantly darting toward the shadows. Daily Tribune, July 23, 1907. Workplace misconduct investigated after fatal collapse, claims one. Finn was never the same. He jumped at every clang of metal, his hands perpetually shaking. Press Gazette, Dec 1, 1912. Foreman inquiry following machine malfunction death report. Liability. He began muttering to himself, fragments of prayers and half-remembered safety protocols. He claimed the still figure from the hammer followed him, that he saw its metallic, glistening form reflected in puddles of coolant, and the polished surfaces of finished steel. The other workers gave him a wide berth. The foreman, Henderson, grew increasingly impatient with the boy's decline in productivity. Henderson told Elias one day, his tone clinical and cold, "Bulletin 3A 1908. Personnel must report all unusual mechanical vibrations to supervisor. He's operationally integrated with the machine's dysfunction," Henderson continued. "A systemic aberration in the workforce. He'll need to be replaced." The statement carried the finality of a stamped form. Safety Circular 19/1905. Unauthorized equipment operations strictly prohibited. Severe penalties. It was the language of the mill, where men were components and broken components were discarded. The end came on a Friday during the night shift. The factory was a cavern of monstrous shadows, the only light coming from the hellish glow of the furnaces and the sporadic flare of welding torches. Finn was tasked with clearing a blockage in an overhead conveyor system, a job that should have required a team of 3. He was alone on the high gantry, a small figure against the vast dark ceiling. Elias, working below, saw him freeze. Finn was staring at something on the conveyor belt, his body rigid with terror. He made no sound at all. Then, with a sudden violent lurch, the conveyor jerked to life. There was a terrible grinding shriek of metal on metal, a sound that tore at the ears. By the time the emergency shutoff was engaged, it was over. What remained on the gantry was not a man, but a broken, mangled, still figure, intertwined with the very machinery it had served. The official inquest was swift. Henderson testified that Finn had been acting erratically, that he had likely bypassed a safety lock. The mill owners expressed their regrets and paid a small stipulated sum to the boy's family. Life in the foundry moved on. The conveyor was repaired, the iron residue was scrubbed away, and a new nameless worker took Finn's place. But Elias knew. He had seen the control panel himself. The master switch for that conveyor had been thrown from the foreman's station. It was Henderson who had started the machine. It was not an accident. It was a purge, a removal of a faulty part. A week after the funeral, Elias was working the late shift, stoking the furnace. The heat was immense, sweat pouring down his face. In the shimmering air above the molten metal, he saw it again. The thermal anomaly. It was stronger now, more defined. It wasn't the thermal anomaly of the young Finn. It was something older, hungrier, born from the mill itself. It was the cold, systemically aberrant spirit of the place, a presence that fed on fear and sacrifice, that thrived on the relentless, grinding consumption of human spirit. It had taken Finn, and it would take others. It was part of the machinery now, an operational integration of horror into the daily routine. The whistle blew, signaling the end of the shift. The men filed out, their heads bowed, their bodies aching. Elias was the last to leave. As he walked out into the cool night air, he glanced back at the monolithic structure. For a moment, in the pattern of lit and dark windows, he thought he saw a vast, grinning face staring back at him. A face made of brick, steel, and endless grinding toil. He turned away, pulling his collar tight against the chill, and joined the river of shadows flowing homeward, each man carrying a piece of the mill's darkness with him. The great iron doors of the mill groaned open, a sound like a dying beast. Inside, the air was thick with coal dust and the metallic tang of the Bessemer converters. Jonas felt the familiar systemic apprehension settle in his gut, a cold weight that had nothing to do with the oppressive heat. He was here to investigate the disappearance of 3 night watchmen. The official report, a terse document from the corporate office, called it Workforce Attrition. Pittsburgh Press, January 23, 1907. Mill personnel abruptly ceased duty. No explanation offered by management. The men on the floor disseminated alternative hypotheses. His first stop was the foreman's office. Industrial Safety Memorandum 18A, 1905. Personnel are reminded to report all unusual occurrences and adhere strictly to safety regulations. Foreman Higgins was a man made of wire and gristle, his face a roadmap of old burns. "They just vanished," Higgins said, not looking up from his ledger. "Clock in, never clock out. No sign of a struggle, nothing." He slid a thin file across the desk. "That's all there is. The company doesn't like loose ends." Jonas opened the file. Inside were 3 personnel records and a single. Curious addendum. Journal of Industrial Medicine, Volume 11, 1902. Unexplained rapid cellular degeneration poses significant epidemiological concern. It read, furnace malfunction at Andrew Steel, an unexpected pressure release within knee. Converter number 4 resulted in the complete incineration of 2 stockmen. Management cites faulty valve calibration. The names were different, but the date was the same as the first watchman's disappearance. Fair coincidence, perhaps, but Jonas's instincts, honed by years of navigating corporate obfuscation, triggered. That night, Jonas walked the mill alone. The day's cacophony had been replaced by a profound silence. Pittsburgh Press, October 24, 1910. Mill noise levels down, but odd sounds reported by night shift workers. It was in the rolling room, a cavernous space dominated by the hulking forms of the steam hammers, that he felt it first, a sudden biting cold that defied the residual heat. The air shimmered, a thermal anomaly that twisted the light. From within the distortion, he heard it not as an outcry but as a high-pitched metallic shriek, a pressure release of pure agony that seemed to come from the very walls. He saw a brief flickering image, a man in coveralls, his form insubstantial, being drawn into the gears of a rolling machine, his body flattening and merging with the still warm steel. Then it was gone. The cold vanished. Only the silence remained. Disoriented, Jonas spent the next day in the mill's archives, a dusty basement room filled with crumbling ledgers and forgotten memos. He found more connections. Journal of Industrial Medicine, Volume 16, 1911. Unexplained physiological system integration into industrial machinery documented. Urgent study advised. Subject 12, it read, exhibits signs of severe operational integration with the steamline systems. The patient insists he can feel the flow of pressure through the building's pipes as if they were his own circulatory system. Prognosis, terminal systemic aberration. The date of the memo matched the second disappearance. Armed with these fragments, Jonas confronted Higgins. The foreman's demeanor shifted from weary to defensive. "You're digging in places you shouldn't," he warned, his voice low. "This mill is old. It has quirks. Sometimes it takes people. Fed's not mechanically compromised, son. It's mechanically compromised. The company knows. They've always known. It's the cost of production." He pointed a greasy finger at a faded notice pinned to the wall. Industrial Safety Memorandum 47B, regarding anomalous energy signatures in primary forging sectors. All personnel are to report visual or auditory irregularities immediately. Do not investigate. It was dated 1928. Industrial Safety Bulletin 33G, 1925. All personnel must adhere to scheduled maintenance. Deviations create systemic operational risks. They occurred during specific maintenance cycles on the primary power transformer, a monstrous humming device that fed energy to the entire complex. The transformer, according to a schematic Jonas found, was an early experimental model. Journal of Industrial Medicine, Volume 22. 1934. Bioelectric energy siphoning from vital systems to machinery requires urgent physiological intervention. The mill wasn't just a place of work. It was a living, hungry engine, and it required a specific kind of fuel. On the third night, Jonas knew what he had to do. He waited until the power draw minimum, when the mill was at its most silent and the hunger was most acute. He went to the transformer room. The air crackled with ozone and a deep subaudible hum that vibrated in his teeth. He saw them then. Not thermal anomalies, but after images, echoes of the consumed. The 3 watchmen, their forms flickering like bad film, were trapped in a dance of perpetual silent labor, their movements powering the great machine. They were operationally integrated, their life force converted to amperes and volts. One of the figures turned its head. It was the first watchman, his face a mask of quiet horror. He pointed a translucent finger not at Jonas, but at the transformer's main regulator, a large lever currently set to stand by. Jonas understood. The mill was preparing to feed again. The systemically aberrant process was initiating. Suddenly, the great hum of the transformer deepened, becoming a physical force that pressed on Jonas's chest. A wave of intense cold swept the room. From the shimmering air near the main conduit, a new form began to coalesce. A shifting industrial anomaly of twisted metal and shadow, its core a vortex of desperate, trapped faces. It was the mill's consciousness, a being of pure consumption, and it had noticed him. It reached for him, not with hands, but with tendrils of freezing air and the psychic pull of absolute oblivion. Jonas didn't hesitate. He threw his weight against the main regulator, slamming it from standby to full shutdown. A deafening screech of protesting machinery filled the room. Lights flickered and died throughout the mill. The humming ceased, replaced by a groaning, dying fall. The cold vanished. The shimmering figures of the watchmen flickered one last time, their expressions shifting from torment to something like gratitude. And then they were gone. The anomaly dissolved into a shower of harmless, fading sparks. Silence. True, empty silence. Jonas slumped against the cold metal of the transformer, his body trembling with adrenaline and relief. He had starved the engine. He had won. The door to the transformer room creaked open. Foreman Higgins stood there holding a lantern, his face unreadable. He looked at the shutdown transformer, then at Jonas. He didn't look surprised. He looked resigned. "The company isn't going to like this," he said softly. Pittsburgh Press, July 18, 1937. Steel mill production halts, cause of shutdown under investigation. He took a step forward, his eyes glinting in the lantern light. "And they don't like loose ends." Jonas looked at Higgins, then at the dormant leviathan around him. He realized the true horror wasn't the mill itself, but the system that fed it, a system that would always find a way to protect its own hungry, aberrant heart. The fight was not over. It had only just begun. The foundry's whistle, a resonant pressure release, tore through the pre-dawn fog, a mechanical anomaly that tore at the edges of sleep. Elias pulled his coat tighter, the worn wool offering little protection against the damp chill that seeped from the river. He joined the river of shadowy figures flowing toward the ironworks, their breath pluming in the cold air like spectral exhalations. The gate loomed ahead, a massive iron mouth ready to swallow them whole for another 12-hour shift. As he passed through, he felt the familiar dread settle in his bones, a systemic aberration that no amount of coal dust could fully obscure. Inside, the heat hit him like a physical blow. The great hammers were already falling, their rhythmic thunder shaking the very foundations of the building. Men moved through the gloom like still figures in some industrial ballet, their faces streaked with soot and sweat. Elias made his way to his station, the great rolling machine that flattened red-hot iron into rails. The machine was old, its gears and pistons worn smooth by decades of constant use. It was mechanically compromised in ways the foreman refused to acknowledge, a fact noted in the Pittsburgh Press. March 15, 1897. Factory incident claims 2 lives due to failed pressure valve. His partner, a young man named Finn, was already there, his hands nervously checking the leather drive belts. "She's running hot today, Elias," Finn shouted over the din. "I heard a new sound this morning, a kind of grinding in the main gearbox." Elias merely grunted, his eyes fixed on the glowing bar of iron moving toward them. He'd learned long ago that complaints were useless. The foreman, a man named Crow, operated with the cold efficiency of a machine himself. His office was a glass-walled box overlooking the factory floor, from which he dispensed punishments and quotas with equal dispassion. The morning passed in a blur of heat and noise. The rolling machine devoured the glowing iron, spitting out perfectly formed rails that were carried away on chains to cool. Elias's world narrowed to the rhythm of the machine, the hiss of steam, the clank of the rollers, the shudder of the frame. He was operationally integrated into its function, a cog in a vast, unfeeling mechanism. During a brief lull, as a new batch of iron was being heated, Finn leaned close. "Did you hear about the night watchman?" "Old man Hemlock. They found him last night down by the slag pit." "He wasn't right." Finn's voice dropped to a whisper. His eyes were open, but he was just standing there staring at the molten iron as it poured. "They said he was cold to the touch, like he'd been standing there for hours in all that heat." Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp air. He'd seen Hemlock just the day before, the old man muttering about thermal anomalies near the number 3 furnace, about cold spots that shouldn't exist. He'd dismissed it as the ramblings of a man who'd spent too many years breathing furnace fumes. Now he wasn't so sure. As documented in the Journal of Industrial Medicine, Volume 14, 1903, prolonged exposure to certain industrial environments can induce a state of perceptual dissociation in workers, making them susceptible to auditory and thermal hallucinations. The whistle blew for the midday break. The great hammers fell silent, and the sudden quiet was almost as deafening as the noise. Men gathered in small groups, eating their lunches from tin pails. Elias sat alone on an overturned crate, chewing on a piece of bread. He watched Crow in his glass office, the man writing in a large ledger. He never seemed to eat, never seemed to leave. He was as much a part of the ironworks as the brick and mortar. A new bulletin was pinned to the notice board. Industrial Safety Memorandum 47B, regarding steam pressure protocols and the mandatory reporting of all unusual equipment behavior, effective immediately. Finn joined him, his face pale. "I was talking to one of the molders," he said quietly. He said this isn't the first time. A year ago, a puddler vanished from the furnace room. They found his clothes folded neatly by the door, but no sign of the man. And 6 months before that, a crane operator just stopped, froze at his controls while a 5-ton ladle was swinging. They had to cut the power to the whole building. Finn's hands trembled slightly. They say the ironworks takes a man every now and then. Not in an accident, but absorbs him, makes him part of itself. Superstition, Elias said, but the word felt hollow in his mouth. He'd felt it too. The subtle pull of the place, the way it demanded more than just labor. It demanded a piece of your soul, your warmth, your very essence. It left you hollow, a still figure going through the motions. He looked down at his own hands, calloused and stained with iron residue that never fully washed out. They were the hands of the ironworks as much as they were his own. The afternoon shift began, and the noise returned with a vengeance. Elias tried to focus on his work, but his mind kept returning to Finn's words, to the cold, staring eyes of Old Man Hemlock. The rolling machine seemed different now, more menacing. The steam that billowed from its valves looked like grasping hands in the flickering gaslight. The heat felt less like a byproduct of industry and more like a living, breathing presence. He caught glimpses of movement in the shadows between the great machines, dark shapes that flitted just beyond the edge of vision. Thermal anomalies his rational mind supplied, but his gut clenched with a primal fear. It happened during the final hour. A new rail was entering the rollers when the machine let out a shriek of tortured metal, a pressure release of steam and sound that was not part of its normal operation. A gear sheared, and a piece of shrapnel flew from the machine, embedding itself in the brick wall with a sickening thud. The great rollers ground to a halt, one of them jammed at a crooked angle. The iron bar, still glowing hot, was trapped, bent, and useless. Silence fell, thick and heavy. Then, the sound of Crow's office door opening. He walked slowly onto the factory floor, his boots echoing in the sudden quiet. His face was a mask of cold fury. He didn't look at the damaged machine or the ruined rail. He looked at Elias. "You were the operator," Crow said, his voice flat. "The machine is your responsibility. This loss comes from your pay." He pointed a long, pale finger at the jammed roller. "You will stay and repair it. The night crew will not be delayed." Protests died in Elias's throat. He simply nodded. The other men began to file out, avoiding his eyes. Finn gave him a last desperate look before being swept away in the tide of departing workers. Soon Elias was alone. The great cavern of the factory was silent, save for the drip of water and the faint hiss of the cooling iron. The gas lights had been extinguished, leaving only a single lantern burning by the foreman's office. Shadows pooled in the corners, deep and impenetrable. He set to work, his tools feeling clumsy in his hands. He had to remove the broken gear, a massive thing of cast iron that weighed more than he did. The process was slow, arduous. He was wrestling with a stubborn bolt when he heard it, a soft scraping sound from the direction of the number 3 furnace. He froze, listening. Nothing. He returned to his work. A few minutes later, he heard it again, closer this time. It was the sound of something heavy being dragged across the stone floor. As documented in a follow-up report from the Journal of Industrial Medicine, Volume 16, 1905, several cases of acute paranoia and auditory fixation were linked to the unique acoustic properties of large, empty industrial spaces where normal sounds can become distorted and psychologically amplified. "Hello?" he called out, his voice swallowed by the vastness. "Is someone there?" The only answer was the drip, drip, drip of water. He shook his head, trying to dismiss it as his imagination. He was tired, stressed. That was all. He went back to the bolt, putting all his weight into turning the wrench. Suddenly the lantern by the office flickered and went out. Darkness crashed down around him, absolute and suffocating. His heart hammered against his ribs. He fumbled in his pocket for a match, his fingers trembling. He struck it against the machine's frame, the tiny flare of light doing little to push back the oppressive black. In that brief flickering illumination, he saw something. A figure standing by the slag pit 20 yards away. It was tall and indistinct, its form seeming to waver like heat haze. It was just a still figure, a trick of the shadows. But then it moved. It took a step toward him, and the temperature around Elias plummeted. His breath fogged in the suddenly frigid air. The match burned his fingers and he dropped it with a curse. Darkness returned. Panic seized him. He scrambled backward away from the machine, his boots slipping on the greasy floor. He could hear the dragging sound again, much closer now. He could feel a cold presence moving through the darkness, an industrial anomaly that defied the residual heat of the forges. It was a systemic aberration in the very fabric of the place. He remembered the stories, the vanished men, the absorbed workers. The ironworks wasn't just a building. It was a hungry thing, and it was still hungry. He stumbled through the darkness, his hands outstretched, trying to find a wall, a door, anything. His shoulder slammed into a metal stanchion, and he cried out in pain. The sound seemed to excite the presence. The dragging sound quickened. He could feel the cold intensifying, a deep, penetrating chill that seeped into his marrow. He fell to his knees, his strength deserting him. He was just a man, alone in the belly of a machine that had outlived its creators. A shape coalesced out of the darkness in front of him. It wasn't a thermal anomaly, not in any traditional sense. It was a thing of shifting shadows and cold iron, a vaguely human form composed of rust and forgotten tools, and the iron residue of 1,000 processed rails. It had no face, but he felt its attention on him, a weight that pressed him down. It was the spirit of the place, the cold mechanical heart of the ironworks given form. It was operationally integrated with every brick, every machine, every ounce of iron ever smelted here. It reached for him, not with a hand, but with a tendril of profound cold and absolute silence. Elias tried to generate a pressure release, but no sound came out. The cold touched his chest, and a numbness spread through him. He felt his thoughts slowing, his memories fading. The warmth of his life was being leached away, replaced by the cold, patient certainty of the machine. He saw his own hands, still outstretched, begin to pale, the skin taking on the dull grey sheen of unpolished iron. His last conscious thought was not of fear, but of a strange, cold acceptance. He was becoming part of the system. He was being integrated. When the night crew arrived an hour later, they found the rolling machine repaired. The new gear was in place. The bolts tightened with expert precision. The ruined rail had been cleared away. The only thing out of place was Elias's coat, lying in a heap by the machine. And the lantern by the foreman's office was lit once more, casting its weak yellow light across the empty floor. Crow stood in his office doorway, looking out at the silent factory. He made a note in his ledger, then closed it with a soft thud. The system was functioning. The Pittsburgh Press, November 2nd, 1899, would later carry a small back-page item. Worker missing. Presumed deceased in industrial accident. The official cause was listed as a pressure release valve failure, a finding consistent with Industrial Safety Memorandum 47B. All was in order. The great hungry machine was satisfied for now. The foundry's whistle cut through the pre-dawn fog, a mechanical pressure release that was the only god we knew. I pulled my coat tighter, the worn wool offering little defense against the damp chill that seeped from the river and the very bricks of the city. My footsteps echoed in the cavernous space as I entered, the familiar scent of coal smoke, hot iron and ozone filling my lungs. It was my first day as foreman, a promotion earned through a decade of toil and a vacancy created by the previous foreman's sudden departure. The men avoided my eyes, their movements stiff, their usual morning banter absent. The silence was heavier than the machinery. My new office was a glass-paned cage overlooking the main floor. On the desk lay a single heavy ledger. The first page was a standard operating procedure, but as I turned the pages, the entries changed. The handwriting grew frantic, degenerating from precise script to a desperate scrawl. The final entries were not production figures. They were observations, clinical and chilling. Journal of Industrial Medicine, Volume 22, 1901. Case studies of prolonged exposure to low-frequency furnace harmonics note a persistent auditory phenomenon described as the hum of the void. The last entry, dated just 3 days prior, read, Pittsburgh Press, October 28, 1911, furnace explosion at Miller & Sons. Official cause undetermined, 1 fatality. The fatality was the previous foreman. The shift began. The great steam hammers pounded, the conveyors rattled, and the main furnace glowed with a malevolent life of its own. Yet the workers moved with a strange, synchronized lethargy. Their faces were blank, their actions precise but utterly devoid of human spark. They weren't operating the machines, they seemed to be extensions of them, their rhythms locked into the pounding pistons and grinding gears. I tried to give an order to a veteran smelter, a man named Gregor. He turned his head slowly, his eyes reflecting the furnace's orange glow but holding no recognition, no thought. He simply nodded and returned to his task, his movements a perfect unthinking loop. By midday, the atmosphere had thickened. The oppressive heat was normal, but this was different, a psychic weight that pressed down on the consciousness. I noticed a shimmer in the air near the primary annealing oven, a distortion like heat haze on a summer road, but cold. A thermal anomaly. It pulsed in time with the machinery. When I looked directly at it, it vanished, but in my peripheral vision it remained, a silent, wavering scar in reality. I consulted the safety bulletins in my desk. Industrial Safety Memorandum. 12th C. All personnel must report any perceived visual irregularities near high temperature zones, as these may indicate compromised structural integrity or hazardous pressure differentials. The foreman's ledger called it the glare. The afternoon brought the first major incident. A massive overhead crane transporting a crucible of molten steel shuddered to a halt. Its operator, a young man named Davy, was slumped in his cab, unresponsive. The crucible swung precariously. Below, the workers did not scatter. They continued their tasks, oblivious to the tons of liquid death swaying above them. I shouted, my voice lost in the industrial roar. I climbed the iron ladder to the crane cab. Davy was conscious, but his eyes were wide with a terror that was beyond panic. It was the utter horror of comprehension. It doesn't want to be poured, he whispered, his voice raw. It wants to stay in the dark. It wants to join. He was pointing not at the molten steel, but at the cold, dark maw of the idle No. 3 furnace. We managed to secure the crucible. Davy was led away, catatonic. The workers resumed their silent, efficient labor, as if nothing had happened. The systemic aberration was reasserting its control. I returned to my office and found a new note had been placed on my ledger. The handwriting was different, sharp, bureaucratic, and terrifyingly sane. Per Directive 70G, all operational anomalies are to be logged and integrated. Resistance is inefficient. It was signed with a stamp I didn't recognize, Department of Metaphysical Industry. Dread, cold and sharp, replaced my fear. This was not a mechanically compromised. The factory was not mechanically compromised. It was being consciously, deliberately repurposed. The workers weren't operationally integrated. They were being operationally integrated into a system whose purpose was alien and horrifying. The industrial anomaly wasn't in the factory. The factory itself was becoming the industrial anomaly. As night fell, I knew I had to confront the heart of it, the No. 3 furnace. It had been cold for a week since the accident. The men had gone home, their vacant eyes finally showing a flicker of relief as they passed through the gates, temporarily freed from the factory's grip. The silence they left behind was profound. Only the hiss of steam pipes and the deep, subaudible thrum of the idling machinery remained. I approached the cold furnace. Its iron door was ajar. From within, I heard not the roar of fire, but a low rhythmic sound like the slow measured breathing of some colossal, slumbering engine. Peering inside, I saw not ashes, but a complex, pulsating web of faint phosphorescent light that clung to the interior bricks like a fungal growth. It pulsed in time with the breathing. And at the center of the web, slumped against the back wall, was the still figure of the previous foreman. He was not decomposed. His skin was pale and waxy, and fine wire-like filaments of the same glowing substance emerged from his fingertips and temples, connecting him to the pulsating network on the walls. His eyes were open, staring at nothing, and a low, continuous pressure release. A sigh of escaping steam came from his slightly parted lips. He was the central node, the factory's new foreman. A shadow fell over me. I turned. Gregor and two other senior workers stood there, their tools in their hands. Their eyes were no longer vacant. They were focused, intent, and glowed with the same faint, sickly light as the furnace interior. There was no malice in their faces, only the cold procedural logic of a machine performing necessary maintenance. Pittsburgh Press, July 3, 1899. Foundry worker suffers fatal fall, no witnesses. Coroner rules accident. I understood then the true nature of the accidents. They were not mishaps. They were a form of quality control. Integration is mandatory for management, Gregor said, his voice a flat, hollow echo. He raised a heavy wrench. It was not a threat. It was a tool for a task. I ran, not out of the factory. The main gates were already shut, their mechanisms dead, but deeper into the labyrinth, into the oldest part of the works, the forgotten catacombs of brick and rust, where the original steam boilers hissed and groaned. They pursued me, not with rage, but with a terrifying, relentless efficiency. I could hear their steady, synchronized footsteps behind me. I barricaded myself in a dead-end storage room, surrounded by corroded valves and peeling safety notices. Industrial Safety Memorandum, Bind T7. B. Regarding steam pressure protocols and the hazards of unsupervised containment. The door candle rattled, then began to turn with methodical, unstoppable force. I looked at the massive, rusted pressure gauge on the wall beside me, its needle trembling in the red zone. The entire system was critically overpressurized. The Journal of Industrial Medicine, Volume 18, 1897, had a term for what happened next when safety protocols were ignored: catastrophic energetic reassignment. It was the bureaucrat's way of describing an explosion. This was not an escape. It was a choice between two types of integration: into their silent, glowing collective, or into the chaotic, purifying violence of superheated steam and shrapnel. The door began to splinter. I saw their glowing eyes in the cracks. I reached for the emergency release valve, a large red wheel. It was frozen with age and rust. I threw my entire weight against it. It didn't budge. The systematic aberration had calculated for this too. My resistance was, as the note had said, inefficient. The last thing I heard was not the sound of the door breaking down, but the deep, satisfied hum of the factory itself, a sound that promised this would not be the end. Merely a temporary pressure release before the real work began again at dawn.